Welcome, Fazlun Khalid. Thank you for coming on.
Not at all.
We're going to carry on from our last time. This is part two to our previous episode. Last time we talked about your story. We talked about IFES. We talked about some of the things you've done and what got you started with the issue of climate change and Islamic eco-theology. Today, what we'll do is we'll build on from that and we'll talk about the environmental crisis. We'll start off with, I think, what the causes are, because it's in the news a lot. I think on BBC now they have a special tab now as well for the climate. But I think it's important to just go over what exactly are we talking about. Is it just climate change, or are there other things as well, like ocean acidification or wildlife loss and things like that? So, Haj, if you want to expand on
Yeah,
that, what the causes of climate change are and what the environmental crisis is in general.
yeah, inshallah. Um, well, the United Nations Environment Program has reduced this to three major issues, three major headlines, under which the other issues sit um, quite uncomfortably, I would say. And they are, firstly, what is first and foremost, and what we are experiencing today is climate change, which now almost everybody is talking about. It's in the news almost every day. And people are trying to deal with this issue in the best way they think fit. And some people, I still have a feeling that the people who are dealing with it are still in the minority. And in the Muslim community, a very small minority who even understand the issues. And this is what we are trying to do in the work that we have started. The second major issue is what they call loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity is short form for the biological diversity, which incorporates every living thing on the earth. Every biological being on the earth is encompassed in this phrase. And this is now that the COP issue is beginning to, as in beginning to, the climate issue is beginning to sensitize people. The loss of biodiversity is still behind, in the sense that people are not quite aware about what's happening to the other species. We as a human species, the dominant community is doing to the other species in the way that we are behaving, in the way that we are conducting our lives. And right now in Montreal, in Canada, there is now COP15 of the Biodiversity Convention, which is trying to put together a human response to the human-created situation of loss of biological diversity. So COP, people hear about COP. COP just means Conference of Parties. So the Conference of Parties in biological diversity element is now Conference of Parties 15, whereas last month, in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, Conference of Parties 27, was to do with climate change. So we shouldn't confuse the COPs. COPs just mean Conference of Parties. So that simply means that the climate issue has been the human community have been dealing for 27 years, officially, the big boys, through the United Nations Environment Program and so on. And biological diversity has only been discussed internationally for 15 years. So we got COP27 climate change, COP15 biological diversity. The third major element is pollution. Air pollution, sea pollution, earth pollution. And the biggest area of pollution which is stirring the gray matter of the international community is plastic pollution. Plastic is everywhere. They don't know what to do with it. You see, and now there's been, if my memory serves me correct, there's so many things to absorb. Quite recently, there's been a plastic protocol about how to control the production, the use, and the recycling of plastic. It's a big, big, big issue. It's everywhere, and it is even in the fetus of babies before they're born. They've got plastic pollution, so it's in our system, and so and then you have air pollution. Air pollution other than climate change, carbon dioxide, is so the air we breathe is polluted. Sea pollution, the sea is polluted. The sea is full of plastic, amongst other chemicals that we wash down our toilets and our wash basins every day. We don't realize what we're doing. The amount of chemicals that we use, artificial chemicals that we produced, are being introduced into nature, and nature cannot cope with it. It is an alien product, these chemicals. So there are three major issues under which can be subsumed other issues that we confront every day in our lives. So they are the headings, you see. And so what we are trying to do as a Muslim community, and what my organization has been trying to do, is to sensitize the Ummah, Muslim community, about the issues that we are confronting today and how to deal with them. That is a challenge for us.
Great. And I think one of the a few of the evidences we see is like this summer has been one of the worst summers we've had in the past 20 years. I think it's been the hottest. There's been droughts across Europe. There's flooding in Pakistan. So I think this year a lot of people have become really sensitized to the issue. But another example is just when you go on the motorway. I think when I was a child and you went on the motorway, the car would be covered by insects at the front. And now when you go on the motorway, the car is relatively clean. And this is an example of biodiversity loss, isn't it?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, the loss of biomass. I mean, that's a very interesting point. We were talking about the other day. I was talking to my wife about it, about where having all the insects gone. You've got to constantly keep the windscreen moving, but there are no insects doing the what you call suicide missions onto the car windscreens, and they're clean, and they're insects. But the thing is, those insects are so important to our own lives. We don't think about it. They are part of the chain of life. You see, they all contribute, every single living being contribute to the well-being of the planet. You know, we may not like the creepy crawlies and the flies that buzz around our ears, but they are part of the biological diversity, which is part of the inheritance of the earth. This is where Allah created it, you see, and we are interconnected with it. There is no disconnection between us and the worms on the soil. What is the connection? You know, what do the worms do in the soil? You know, they aerate the soil. They allow the plants to grow, and when the plants grow, what happens? Well, of course, you know there are other insects that do not that damage the plants, and when we have to deal with that, you know, in the way that we have always done. But now when you introduce chemicals, it kills everything, including the bees. You see, so indiscriminate action, you see. And we're at a loss about what to do with it. And this is why, if you're talking about agriculture, this is why the organic farming movement, the permaculture movement, they are gaining ground, but nowhere near fast enough. Because as the human population grows, more and more food need to be produced. And the people who produce food in bulk are the big boys, like the Americans. And now you hear what happened in Ukraine. And until the war, we did not know that Ukraine was a great producer of wheat, you see. And if the wheat is not grown in bulk, people in parts of Africa and the parts of Asia can't eat.
Yeah.
You see, so there is this interconnection that we must consider, and this is not articulated sufficiently globally, and is not articulated enough within the Muslim community, because the aspect of interconnection is there all the time in the Quran. If you read the Quran and Allah's creation, there is this connection that we cannot ignore. The aspect of the fitra, the aspect of the mizan of creation, they all connect us to the rest of creation. See, and which is I won't say ignored by the ulama. I think we have to educate the ulama as well. You see, but it is not sufficient to know about how to wash your hands and face and feet and how to be clean, to do wudu and all this kind of, and the laws concerning births, marriages, and deaths. All these are kind of standard ulama material. Okay, we can quote endless hadiths about the behavior of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, but do we need to relate his actions in terms of his relationship with the earth, which is what the ulama are not doing. They think this whole environmental thing is a plot generated by the West to undermine them. They need to wake up.
They've been thinking that for a long time, a plot to undermine them. I remember in the reason why they banned the Muslims, the ulama, they banned the printing press was because they didn't want people to read the text for themselves, because they thought they might become redundant. So it's actually not new, this idea of the ulama wanting to keep power.
But there is also a flip side to this, you see, in the sense that we do benefit. We do benefit by the availability of printed material. And it's been available for centuries. The Quran was, when was the Quran first printed? Mass printing the Quran, I think, began in the 12th century.
No, mass printing, it began after the printing press. So I think around the 1800s. Like you had, until then you had scribes, but the mass printing of the Quran
1800, okay, I stand corrected. But now we have translation of the Quran, all languages, people can read the Quran. The problem with that is everybody becomes an alim. They know best, you see. You can draw certain inferences from certain verses in the Quran, which is quite obvious. But in depth, we need deeper knowledge. This is where the ulama comes in. So they have to contribute their deeper knowledge to a wider understanding of what is really going on. You see, but they're not doing this. You see, and they need to wake up. So I mean, don't get me wrong. I respect the ulama community, and they have sustained the Muslim and Islam for all these centuries. When Islam has taken a backseat in the affairs of the world, but now I think our time has come again, in the sense that the Quran has everything to offer in the way that we can deal with the environment. And the Sunnah of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam has everything to offer in the way that we can deal with it. And that emerges, maybe I'm jumping the gun in terms of the question you're going to ask me, that emerges in terms of the Al-Mizan project that we are putting together with the help of the United Nations Environment Programme. It's a major 50,000 word document, which is now being translated into Arabic, which will come out and will underscore the basic approach of the Muslims, basic approach to Islam as a tool for the Muslims to deal with the crises that we face today. You see, and this is where we are going to need the ulama community. This is where we are going to need the help in devising and producing khutbahs to communicate these messages to the wider population. And this is the challenge that we now face.
You mentioned something interesting, which actually I think would necessitate the ulama in this discussion, and that's about, you mentioned population, because we can't ignore that 200 years ago the population of the earth wasn't even 1 billion, right? And so the demand on the resources, demand on how much output the earth can produce, was actually comparatively low. And now with our mass consumer societies, we've got 8 billion people on the earth now. The amount of food that requires, and just materials in general, our ways of life driving so much and consuming so much. Population is a big issue. And how do we Muslims understand the issue, or approach this issue of population and the environment? Because on the one hand, you've got with a greater population requires more resources from the earth, which will necessarily lead to more environmental chaos and destruction. But there's also the aspect of the idea of culling, or it's a very Malthusian take, isn't it? The idea of thinking about, okay, being strategic with population and fertility rates and things like that. So how do we approach that discussion?
Very interesting, but wide and deep question, and people have debated this for decades and really got nowhere with it. I mean, the point that you talk about population, okay, you're right, of course, in the past 200 years, the population was less than a billion. I'll give you an idea, and I think I deal with the aspect of the acceleration of history in the book. The idea of acceleration of history is not mine, I have to say. It comes from an American writer called Henry Adams in the late 19th century, who talked the history is moving so fast, and I began to ask the question why, you see, and it's in the 4th chapter of my book if people want to read it, and I make a comparison between the way the Henry Adams computed the use of energy in the 19th century between 1800 and 1900, and he came to the conclusion that this was the period when the Industrial Revolution was taking off. Between the 18th and 19th century, the acceleration, the consumption of energy, particularly coal-generated steam energy, was exponential. History was accelerating at such a rate that people cannot cope with it. That was the 19th century. And the 20th century experienced a greater acceleration of history. And that acceleration is illustrated by the population growth. And you mentioned figures, and I'll mention a couple of figures. These are rough figures, but they again can, if people don't want to go and read my book, they can always go to Google and download population statistics. It's all there. When the ice receded 12,000 years ago, the human population was estimated to be about 4 million people. That was 12,000 years ago. In 12,000 years up to 1900, the population grew from 4 million to about 1.6. Let's say 2 billion, for roughly. My figure, I remember, is 1.6 million, 1.6 billion. So that's from 4 million to 1.6 billion in 12,000 years. Now, between 1900 and 2000, the current millennium, population grew by 5 billion. Just think about that. So 1.4 billion in 12,000 years and 5 billion in 100 years. So the last century in which my generation was born, saw the growth of population by 5 billion by 2000. Now, 2000 now is 2022, it's grown to 8 billion. Imagine that. So how did this happen? How can the human community cope with this kind of explosion of the human population? And what does it do, or what has it done to the other sentient beings, to other beings? We talk about biodiversity. What is this exponential population growth doing to biodiversity? It's murder, just by the way that we are growing. So we need to consume. So I'll draw your attention to another parallel statistic about consumption, about this growth of human population taxing the Earth's resources. Now, the simple truth is these statistics are available for anybody who wants to go and look at them, you see. And there is an organization called the Global Footprint Network. Again, I quote this in my book. And the Global Footprint Network has been busy for so many years producing statistics about the availability of natural resources and the human impact on the natural resources. You see? Now, last year, the Global Footprint Network informed us that by July 29th, 2021, we had consumed 12 months worth of resources. So for the 5 months of the rest of the year, we've been taking out of nature what nature cannot give us or should not give us. Now, this year, that date has been advanced to the 28th of July. You see, so by the 28th of July in 2022, we are now consuming, have been consuming for the past 5 months, which nature cannot, which is not available for human community.
No, if I can just interject there, there's also reports which have said that the amount of food that we've been farming, we've actually over-farmed the soil so that it's compromised its ability to provide food in the future. I think there's some areas now which only have 10 to 15 years of actually food left to give in the soil before it just desertifies, because we've just overused and haven't taken care of that.
Exactly, and using non-organic chemical fertilizer, getting the maximum out of the soil. And this is what Rachel Carson discovered in the early 1960s when she wrote her book Silent Spring. So the point I'm making here is that we are getting out of the earth what the earth cannot give us in an expanding population, you see. But coupled with this, what you just said about the over farming of the earth, and that the earth can only give less and less to us. Also, the amount of food waste, billions and billions of tons of food waste, particularly in the West, although not, well, shall we say, the so-called advanced countries, not just the West. It includes Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, so on and so on.
Yeah, I think, Halloween, right? I think there's about 28 million tons of pumpkins which are wasted every year because of Halloween.
Yeah, and that takes energy to grow.
Yeah,
I mean, it's madness. So where do we go from here? You see, and so we need to go back. We need to go back to the beginning, and but the push is coming from the developed countries about they're saying the human connection with the end of nature is over. Now we've got to connect with technology that can give us all the things that we want, you see. And that's a dangerous path that we are going down. And we need to rethink. We have the material to begin to rethink. By we, I mean the Muslims have the material to rethink the future. But also I have to say that we are living in a shared planet. This planet is not exclusively the property of the Muslims. There are Christians and Jews and Buddhists and Hindus and Zen Buddhists and the Dalai Lama and all these people. We all breathe the same air, drink the same water, and live on the same land. And we have to work with them as well. The point I'm making here is that working with them and projecting our own teachings on this is a form of dawah, because I believe, and Christians and other people have told me, well, the Muslims have the best teaching in this, and what are you doing about it? You see, and this is not a Muslim telling me about it. Christians have told me this. So I thought we are working on it. So I'm saying, do not despair. There is hope. There is hope, but we need to begin to act, because in the amal of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he is an environmentalist. The point being that environmentalism is also is a new thing, that we created a problem, create an ism, and create a speciality, create a specialism. You see, but environmentalism existed long before environmentalism came into being. You see, so if you follow the Sunnah of Rasul, we are all environmentalists. That's a simple message that I can give.
And how do we? So let's continue the idea of population, right? So as Muslims, how do we look forward to the future and say, okay, there's an environmental crisis happening. Do we choose to have less children now because of that? Is that a valid thing to do as a Muslim? To say, I'm concerned for the environment, therefore I'm going to reduce future strain on the earth by having less children?
I think that would be a sensible thing to say.
Many scholars might disagree.
Pardon?
I think there's hadith about the Prophet saying, encouraging Muslims to have children. So a lot of that might be quite controversial.
Well, you see, it's like this. You see, hadith is fine. I accept that hadith. You see, but then we have to consider consider the hadith alongside with other things. At the time of the Rasul, there were no such thing as banks and bank drafts and overdrafts and debt and all that kind of thing. There was no such thing as that, you see. But alongside the hadith, we also need to consider the verse of the Quran which forbids riba as doing sujood to the shaitan. You see, what riba has done is distort the natural world. We are living in a distorted world. We are not living in the way that the Rasul and his companions lived. It is not that world. We are living in a different world, you see, a different world which, by our own behavior, is destroying the fabric of the natural world. You've got to take that into consideration. So, fine, if you are living in the kind of world that the Rasul and his companions lived, then that is valid. What I'm saying now is that world has changed, and we have changed it, and we have changed it for the worse. And the consequences of that is what we are talking about today. You see, so we have to respond to that. You see, so what I'm saying is, I would argue that it is valid for people to have less children today because of the kind of world that we have created. You know, and so people need education. You know, and if you can grow your own food and feed your own people and live in a close community and you can have as many children as one, go ahead and do it. But we can't. And people look at the amount of refugees there that we need to feed today. And most of the refugees today are Muslims. Mm-hmm. Where are they? How are we going to feed them? Are we going to tell the refugees have as many babies as you want? Living in a refugee camp? You see, so we need to look at context. It's okay, the ulama saying this is what the Rasul said. I said, the ulama, look at context. Look at today and look at the behavior of Rasul. Look at the country of Rasul.
Yeah, because in the Prophet's time, resources were abundant. You know, there weren't many people around. I think even Plato, he talks about, I think, in one of his books, that resources are abundant, so just go out and farm as much as you can. But yeah, in today's world, resources are very, very scarce. And also, it's very expensive to have a family now as well. So people should consider that as well.
Expensive in the sense that we are living in a riba society, you see, and the whole aspect of life is now artificial in the sense that we are all managed by the banks. About the lack of resources, let me go back to the Global Footprint Network again. You know, I've been following their statistics for a number of years now, and I was asking myself the question: if we are living beyond our means today, the globe as a whole, if the earth as a whole, if the 8 billion people in the earth today, they are living beyond their means today, and then at what point was there a balance of human population and what the earth can give us? In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and many centuries after that, there was a lot of room for people to expand. There was enough to have each family to have 20 children. If you want to have them, that's enough for that. But this is not the case today. So I looked at the statistic and puzzling over the point at which there was an equilibrium between what the earth has to offer and the demand of the human population. And I discovered that date is precisely marked as the 1970s. It was the 1970s that the disequilibrium between human population, as it began to exponentially increase, and the amount of food resources were almost static, or the production of the human food resources not coping with the expansion of human population.
And the 1970s is also when neoliberal economics really started to take off.
Yeah,
the gold standard was depegged as well.
That was when Nixon disbanded the gold standard in 1972. Yeah, and also when Margaret Thatcher came and denationalized the whole thing. You see, but that happened. Yeah, I mean that accelerated the process, and that was kind of the last straw in a sense. But this process was happening long before that. The human population was catching up with the amount of food being produced. So we are not comparing like with like, you see. And so while the Rasul no one would dispute what he said, he was correct in that milieu. Now things have changed today. We need to consider where we're living today and what we need to do in order to cope with the situation that we have created, which we need to confront and change. That's the challenge: confront and change, and return to the Sunnah.
And one of the things you mentioned was riba. So let's talk about that, because our economic system is actually one of the drivers of the environmental crisis, in the way that we are forced to grow, we are forced to consume. When you have a debt-backed society, you have to consume and earn more and produce more so that you can pay off those previous debts. And there's no other way around it. So do you think it's possible, or do you think it's realistic that we will ever be free of this economic system? Because if we're being realistic here, unless you get rid of an interest-based system for your finances, you're always going to be in debt, and then you're always going to have to grow, and you're always going to have to consume more and burden the earth more.
Well, there are two ways of looking at it. If you are part of this system and you rely on the economics and the growth and the consumer agenda and the whole economic agenda, then we are not free of it. But you can be free of it now. How can we be free of it? Is we have to live off-grid. You can be free of it, but you have to live off-grid. You see, and there are a few brave, odd people already doing that, but they're in a small minority. So that's the answer. But, can we be free of it? What do you aspire for your children? I mean, you're going to send them to university. If they are clever enough, you're going to send them to university. Why are you going to send them to university? Because through the education, they have better purchasing power. They have a good standard of life. But the standard of life actually means you're taxing the environment. So we are in this sort of double bind. We are trapped. We are trapped in it. So this is why if it collapses, if the whole thing collapses overnight, tomorrow, it will be dog eat dog. The nature of human beings is dog eat dog. But we can sit down and talk about how we can decouple. And I think Muslims can lead this argument because the teachings are very clear, how we can decouple from the current system. You see, create independent communities free of, I forgot the name of the professor at some university, mooted the idea of what you call the donut economy, where you have a circular economy where everything is recycled and reused within this economy, and all economics takes place within this donut economy. That is probably a start for people to begin to consider. Alternatives are already emerging, you see, but Muslims are not there. We need to be there, you see, and how do we get there, you see, and people are now talking about, in my book, there isn't enough room there. Well, let's talk more about it. People are talking about degrowth, and if all you get Liz Truss talking about growth, and she was thrown out, you see, the British Prime Minister, and now Sunak and his Chancellor, the Finance Minister, are still talking about growth, because you cannot grow. There cannot be growth. If you want to protect the environment, you cannot have economic growth. You see, but nobody is the problem with the climate discussion, the COP27 and all the COPs before that, was that the nation states, every nation state to go to the COP, is not willing to compromise on growth, because they were elected by their own population for a better lifestyle. So a better lifestyle actually means growth. So consumerism actually means growth. So we're in a trap. How do you get out of this trap? You see, we need to want less. This reminds me of it's a common story, really. Well, watching the story of uh, Captain Bligh, I've forgotten the name of the film, where he was put on a boat by the mutinous sailors, put on a boat with 2 or 3 other people and given a flask of water and says, "Go away." So what did they do? The people on this boat, he had to ration the water that was supplied so they could survive. So we are in a boat. If you look at the planet like a boat, there's nowhere else to go. There's no planet B. So we have to ration. We have to ration globally. Now, who is going to sit down and who is saying nobody, the strong economies, the developed economies are saying, oh, we will give you so much, but we can only give you so much. But we can't give you any more because we want to give the rest to our own people. So that's very, very selfish. So whole mindset need to change. We need to look at ourselves like we're in a boat with Captain Bligh and his sailors, where there's only one flask of water, and we can only survive for so many days if we ration. And if you look at a planet like a boat swimming in space, there is no other planet B. There's nowhere. Fortunately, Captain Bligh went and landed somewhere else, and it became, I think it was called Christmas Island, because he landed there on Christmas Day. You see, and Captain Bligh's survivors are still there, living on Christmas Island. But if we are willing to grasp the nettle and deal with these issues in the way that we should, see now what happened in COP27 was that the oil-producing countries got their own way. In order to give a little bit of money to certain countries like Pakistan and Nigeria that were inundated with floods and water due to climate change, in order to give them that money, the poor countries had to compromise and say, okay, we are not insisting on certain limits on the production of carbon dioxide. You see, so that's not a solution. It doesn't solve. It solves solves the problem of certain nation states who wants more money in their pockets, but does not solve the global problem. So who is going to grasp the nettle? What I'm saying is that we as Muslims can begin to tackle these issues if we only wake up. And this is why we are producing the Al-Mizan project, inshallah, which will be out next year. And we need to then mobilize the Muslim community to give leadership. I'm saying our time for leadership has come in a very, very positive way, you see. And are we willing to wake up to it? That's the question I would ask the Muslims. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm just saying the growth issue is quite tricky, because the way the economic system is currently set up is that every country is practically in debt. You know, this public finances, it has to borrow money to have a government and deliver public services. Like this country right now, we're borrowing ridiculous sums of money just to service our public finances, which are falling apart as well. And you want growth, you want inflation, because in time that will devalue your debt, and then it makes it easier to pay off the debt. And in fact, you don't need to pay off; you just do the interest payments. So we have a cycle of being stuck in debt, which forces more growth, which makes we need to create more debt or inflate our economies to again devalue the debt, and it's a vicious cycle. And we are seeing, I think, the contradictions now come to the fore, because it might have worked for a while in the 1980s and 90s, but now we're reaping the consequences, and it leaves us in a very tricky scenario.
Yeah, we are back to riba again. You see, the only way that let me put it quite clearly: we are living in an artificial civilization, sustained by debt. All the G7 countries are in debt, and the major G7 countries are in debt to the tune of over 100% over GDP. Imagine that. I mean, the world's most debted country in the world is the United States of America. You see, in that sense, the most dangerous country in the world is the United States of America. Because if it collapses, everything else will collapse. You see, what supports the American system, the dollar system, is the dollar debt. You see, what supports the UK and the European Union is debt. You see, this is why Allah forbade riba to the extent that it will destroy you. It will like doing sujood to the shaitan. That's what it says in Surah Al-Baqarah. You see, and how long can this be sustained? You see, and it's left to be seen. I would say not for long, because people are predicting, even though that there is so much debt, people are still talking about growth, and these are very intelligent people. You know, on the one hand, the British government is talking about dealing with climate change, and on the other hand, they're contradicting it. But they're not. They don't think they're contradicting. They think they're being very, very clever. They have a climate change agenda. Let's say they are very positive about climate change, and let's also argue, the UK and the rest of Europe are very conscious about climate change, and they're doing something about it. Fine, but on the other hand, they're doing exactly the opposite. It counters it by promising people consumerism and better standards of living, which is wholly dependent on debt. You see, and the poor countries like Bangladesh or Gambia or South Africa, they cannot do that because they cannot raise the level of debt that the other countries have, because there is no confidence. The creation of debt depends on confidence. That's all it is. You create money out of nothing. You see, so we created an artificial civilization based on nothing. Now it is digital. Money is not digital. It doesn't exist. You see, every time we use a credit card or a debit card, use a credit card, we create debt. We create money out of digits. That's what happens. So how far can we go on doing this, which ultimately has an impact on the environment? And if we don't change, we'll be talking ourselves to the graves, to end times.
Yeah, it's definitely a solemn time. If you look at history and all the major empires, how they collapse, like the Roman Empire, it's very similar scenarios to what we are now. Like there's a massive devaluation of the currency, issuance of debt, and so on, and that often collapses grand economies. Just want to move on to what the future could look like. So you mentioned in COP that they agreed on to allow a particular amount of CO2. I think that the goal generally is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. What will the future look like if we exceed that? What are the consequences we'll have to live with?
Well, I've been enough said about it. You know, I think it's a frightening scenario. I mean, the forecast or the current situation is that we've gone past the tipping point already. You know, it's going to be difficult to claw back where we are going. That's the scenario, and also particularly with now the exposure to methane streams. Methane is seeping out of the oceans and out of the permafrost in Siberia, and methane is 10 times, I don't know how many times.
It's 25 times more.
How many?
25 times more potent than
more dangerous than carbon dioxide. You see, okay, methane is supposed to have a short life, but in that short life, it will have made its impact. There is no control. You see, and all people don't know how to control. But just imagine, the people are drilling for oil and producing more carbon dioxide to produce more carbon in areas of the Arctic Ocean free of ice, which has been free of ice because of the carbon dioxide pollution. So they're using areas which have been free of ice because of carbon dioxide pollution to create more carbon dioxide. I mean, this is the human race. I mean, you're greedy. We want more and more and more and more and more. Not enough. Nothing's enough. You see, and in the meantime, in the rich countries continue to live off the poor countries in terms of their manufacturing industries and cheap manufacturing. Or the capitalists have gone to, for example, created clothing factories in Bangladesh because of cheap labor, and the cheap materials. Clothes come here and we consume it, and and creating more pollution in those countries. And whilst our own pollution affects countries in the Pacific Ocean, there are a few islands going underwater already, and they've done nothing. They've done nothing to create carbon, almost nothing. What is the Fiji Islands and the other Pacific Islands have done to create carbon dioxide? Nothing. They don't have industries, and because it's global, the industries generated in the West over the past, and now currently China, are creating pollution elsewhere. You see, in other parts of the planet. So, but the point is, people are still talking about growth. People still talk about consumerism. People are not saying, let's have green energy so we can just reduce our consumerism and reduce carbon dioxide. They're just saying, if we have green energy, we can reduce carbon dioxide, but we can go on consuming some more because we have green energy. But consuming some more means still continuing to tax the rest of the Earth systems. You cannot consume without taxing the rest of the Earth systems. And if the consumer levels go high and high and high, we are okay to say, we are producing electric cars and we'll have batteries and all that kind of stuff. But how do you charge the batteries anyway? Oh, we charge the batteries with green energy. Well, how do you create green energy? So you got to manufacture wind power systems. You got to manufacture solar power systems or tidal wave systems. You got to manufacture. All those are for manufacturing. Then where's the consumerism going to come? Or what about the batteries? Well, in order for the batteries to be efficient, we have to mine cobalt. What's the other? Lithium, and all these have got to be mined. You see, that there are lithium deposits supposed to be in Peru somewhere, and Peru is going to look like parts of Texas looks like today, totally destroyed because the big corporations are going to mine lithium and rare earth. Where they're going to come from? And when the batteries eventually die off, where are they going to dump these batteries? You see, it's all short-term consumerism. It's not long-termism at all. It's very, very selfish, power-centered, greedy orient, or it's a capitalist model that's driving us. And again, I say we have the answers, and we got to wake up.
And do you think part of this? I mean, we painted a very bleak picture because that's how it is. But do you think part of the issue is because when you get rid of the sacred in your life, when people don't believe in God anymore, you can do whatever you want in that sense. There's nothing holding you back and saying, hang on, I'm not going to desecrate this land so much. I'm not going to overfarm because there's no responsibility there. You can just do what you want. If you see short-term value and you can take your profits and have that hedonistic life. But actually believing in God, submitting to him, that is actually part of the solution, because you end up recognizing there are limits to things and there's a balance and an order to which you want to orient your life.
Well, you have a point, but I would say that if you believe in God, then you have to listen to God. Mm-hmm. If you believe in God and don't listen to God, well, what is the point? What I'm saying to you is there's a very, very strong hadith which says there will come a time when you will. This is a hadith, there will come a time when you will be in the lizard's hole with them. In the lizard's hole with them. And one of the Sahaba said to the Rasul, Ya Rasulullah, by them do you mean the Yahud and the Nasara? And he said, who else? So we are all in the lizard's hole with the Yahud and the Nasara and the Buddhists and the Christians and the Zen. We are all globally in this lizard's hole. You see, but I maintain that the only people who know how to get out of the lizard's hole is by listening to Allah. And we have the teaching to climb out of the lizard's hole. So believing in Allah is one thing, but listening to what he says is another. You see, but look, we are all, whether you're Malaysian, Indonesian, or Saudi, or Tunisian, or Moroccan, whatever, we are all in the religious world. We all want what they want. We want to match their consumerism, both at the nation state level and also as the individual level. You know, one of the status symbol of the Muslims who have money is a Mercedes Benz. I mean, so what? Of course, we believe. So what I'm saying is, our belief has become just 5 pillars. If we do the Salah, do the Ramadan, and if you go on Hajj and we pay Zakat, and we believe it's okay, you're a Muslim. So we have turned Islam into a religion, and Islam is not a religion. Islam is deen, it's a way. You see, and the 5 pillars are a daily reminder of what our responsibilities are. But do we take on this responsibility? Allah says in Quran, in Surah Rahman, An-Najmu wa-shajaru yasjudan. The plants or the stars and the trees bow in adoration. They do sujood. You see, but do we see the trees going down in sujood? We don't, of course, but they're in sujood by being exactly what they have been created for. Mm-hmm. You see, and what have they been created for? Is to lock carbon dioxide, be scientific about it. They do sujood by being what they are. They lock the carbon dioxide, we spew out of it. But instead of allowing them to do that, we cut them down.
They fulfill their function. As Aristotle said, you know, the way you have happiness and you have a good life is by fulfilling your function. And the trees and the stars, they all fulfill their function.
Will fulfill their function. That's sujood, yeah. But we do sujood 5 times a day and we forget about our function. That's all. That's all the ulama know. You see, yeah, and you know, excuse me, I'm not talking about all ulama. There are a minority, I say a minority of ulama today, and I'm reminded of the Indonesian ulama who have in fact passed environmental fatwas, you know, forbidding cutting trees down or protecting the orangutan. They have passed fatwas. But the problem there is Indonesia is a secular state based on the global paradigm of growth. So the ulama don't have any power. They're good, sincere ulama. They don't have any power. They can say in a khutbah, don't do this, or, you know, don't kill the orangutan, don't pollute the earth, don't pollute the rivers, don't cut down the trees. They can do that. But then the multinational corporations come and take over and persuade the government, look, if you want revenue, if you want revenue, if you want taxes, if you want this, then you've got to develop. You have to grow. So they grow. And that's the nature of the problem that we're confronting. So who is going to stand up and say, no, this is enough. Let's find our way back. You know, in a very, you know, otherwise it just collapse. It'll be dog eat dog.
Indeed. And Fazlun Khalid, that's a good point to end on. Thank you for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. I'm sure our listeners will like this episode as well.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you for having me.